Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Tapestry Pod. I'm Tarun Sakrani, one of your usual hosts, and
I'm Saz Agarwal. Welcome. Look forward to the discussion we're going to have. Tarun, today is a really special episode. We're going to be talking about some trade networks that came out of Sindh way back. And these particular networks, they were actually, doing huge business very quietly. Nobody really was talking about it in a European-dominated world economy. And of course, we all know that Sindh has been a hub of trade for centuries past. It's been on the crossroads of the trade routes. And if you go really far back, as far back as Mohenjo-daro, even then, you see evidence of the trade between the Indus Valley civilization and the ancient civilizations in other parts of the world. When you do excavations in Egypt, you find materials which actually came from the Indus Valley. So obviously those people were the kind of people who knew that what they had, that other people in other parts of the world wanted, and they were supplying them. They were, adventurous. They could get across the seas at a time when travel was really difficult and dangerous. And then further down, of course, we have travelers' accounts, people who traveled, adventurous people from other countries, from Europe, from China, who traveled in India. They also talk about the trade that goes on in Sindh. Shah Abdul Latif, in his Sursamundi, he talks about the women who cry by the water because their husbands have left them and they're waiting for them to come back. And this was Shah Abdul Latif, of course, is the poet saint of Sindh, who lived in the 17th century. And he shaped the language, he shaped the philosophy of Sindh. And even today, even when I've seen this, young Sindhis who've never even heard of him, some of the things they say strike you because they are kind of echoing that philosophy.
such as what? Like, do you have any examples?
I can give you an example. It's not to do with trade, but it's to do with ethnic harmony, the multi-faith harmony. We had Zulfikar Ali Kaloro in our last episode telling us multi-faith shrines of Sindh. I have young people telling, I recently interviewed someone, a young man, who said to me that, I have a little altar in which I have representations from different religions. I had my hair standing up on my arms when I heard that because, it's something that goes back a long way.
Right.
So, so we have this this situation where you have a hub of trade, and this is something which has always been there. If you come closer to the present day, the routes that we will be talking about today, one of them originated in Hyderabad and the other originated in Shikarpur. Now, Shikarpur, of course, was an overland trade route which took place between Central Asia and the Far East. The camel route, going through all these very difficult roads over the mountains, ice-clad mountains, and dangerous in terms of bandits as well as difficult roads.
But it wasn't part of the Silk Road, right? I think it was.
It would have been. I'm not really sure how much I like the word Silk Road because, it's like, kind of a slick term. They were trading all kinds of things. Yeah, they were trading all kinds of things. I think one of the big imports out of India, which nobody wants to talk about, is human traffic.
Right.
That was very big. It was like India was big on selling people even back then. But that's not, really relevant to what we're talking about today. And so Shikarpur was a big place, and Shikarpur came up, I think the Mughal Empire began to decline and Punjab became really volatile. And Multan was a hub of trade, and gradually people moved over from Multan to Shikarpur.
Right.
But they also moved from other places to Shikarpur. And in fact, the person who documented all this, Claude Markovits, he actually calls Shikar a banya melting pot.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah, that's what he says. The other trade route was from Hyderabad. And Hyderabad, though it was an inland city,
Yes.
they were doing a sea route out of Sindh. So this happened when the British came in. And when the British came in, as we know, they deposed the Mirs of Sindh. They sent the Mirs into exile. They separated them from their families. They sent them away in chains. It was really a shameful thing to do because they had treaties. They had signed treaties of eternal friendship with them. But for the traders of Sindh, it was a very bad thing because, first of all, their major clients had been sent away. So, their biggest source of income was deposed, princes and the courts. Of course, the British came in with their own suppliers. They were already, it's not like they just landed in Sindh. They were already all over India. I mean, Sindh was one of the last conquests. So they were very comfortable. They knew what they were doing. They already had everything sorted. So they brought their suppliers with them, and then they later introduced the company rupee. So even the merchants who were doing a banking trade, it was really difficult. They lost their sources of income.
Correct.
But they noticed that the British loved Sindhi handicrafts, and they started dealing in the Sindhi handicrafts. The whole market increased for Sindhi handicrafts, and the Hindu traders were hawking them. They were taking them from door to door. And the main sabs in the house would say, "Is that Sindh work?" And of course, the feriwala would say, "Yes, madam, Sindh work." So they began to be called Sindh workies. And these Sindh workies, they realized that the British loved Sindh work so much that they were like buying lots when they went off home on their home leave, which every 2 or 3 years they would get home leave, and they would push off on a steamer to England. They were filling trunks with Sindh work and taking it with them. So, very soon, one of these young men thought that, oh, not bad, let me try it too, and filled up his own trunk with Sindh work, and 3 or 4 of them got on a steamer and went off.
Wow,
and
okay.
From Karachi, you can go to Aden quite fast, and there you set up your shop.
Yeah.
And, you sell stuff, and then when when you make more money, you send for your brother or for your neighbor's son, and you expand.
Correct.
And when too many Sindh workies come to Aden, then you move along to Cairo and you start your business there, because all you have to do is get into a ship and take your thing. And now you're a British citizen, so you have access to a lot of countries around the world.
Yep.
So these guys actually went all the way to many countries around the world. And they had, some of them set up global trading empires. The initial ones, we had Bohumal, we had Choturmal. There's a bunch of names, these are quite well known. Later on, Chelarams, Chenrais came in. And of course, those empires, they had their, they rose and they fell, like, that's quite normal, right, in business. And so that's what happened with the Sindh workies. Now, the thing is that these two trade networks, they were not known. They were not recorded. I mean, obviously, everybody in Sindh knew them because, as we keep saying, there was money coming in and boys were going away. And the life they lived was really tough because they lived alone in the countries wherever they were. On that camel route, of course, it must have been much harder because they were living in small villages. We don't know, we have no idea what their lives were like, but they were living in difficult conditions. Now, on the sea routes, it wasn't that harsh because they were in cities, they were in ports. And ports always had some kind of comforts. They had people coming in from all over, so the Sindhwarkis very often, their life was they would be sleeping above the shop. And when the ship's horn blew, they would run down to the port and call the sailors up to buy, the passengers up to buy. Even if it was day or night, once the ship comes in, your customers are here. And they have come basically to enjoy themselves. They're passengers, they've come to enjoy themselves. And of course, the sailors are also looking for a break. So you call them to the shop and you sell your stuff. Right. But for them, it was a difficult life because one is, this day and night thing. The other is that they were alone and they only went back to their families every 3 years because that's the way travel was.
Right, okay.
So in Sindh, people knew that this was happening. A lot in the community, the young boys, by the time they were 16, they would be sent off to Sindh work. Either they would join their father in his business or they would go and work with another established firm.
Got it. Okay.
Also, by the time the man turned 40, he would come back and retire and hand over the business to his son or to the next generation. These things were not known. They had never been written about, but they eventually got written about in 1999, 2000. And the person who did that was a French professor.
A French professor. Wow. Okay.
So when you remember when we started talking about doing this podcast and we were thinking about what we would present,
right.
We thought to ourselves that what a lovely thing it would be if Claude Markovits would come on our show and talk to our listeners and tell us about it.
Indeed.
Yeah. And so, of course, I sent that email, not expecting a positive reply.
I know we were waiting with bated breath and anticipation.
Honestly, I just thought, he's never going to reply. If he does, he'll say no. Yeah. So it was a great moment when he replied and said yes. And then we did have a Zoom call with him. But unfortunately, he couldn't connect to Zoom. And in the end, we just did a phone call. So we did hear him. And because it was a phone call and there were so many audio issues, it was only Claude Markovits and me. And Tarun didn't participate, much to our disappointment, because I'm sure Tarun would have had a lot of questions for him.
I did.
But anyway, enough me talking now. Let me just bring Professor Markovits on.
Yay. Here you go.
Professor Claude Markovits is a well-known French historian. But when I think about the kind of huge discoveries he's made and the way in which he went about his work, I actually like to think about him as an archaeologist, because he's excavated ruins in various places and ferreted out interesting artifacts. And he followed his instinct, followed the leads that arose, and he moved on to make the most remarkable discoveries. These discoveries have formed the basis of research for an entire generation of researchers. And we are all so grateful to him for what he started and laid out for us. Amongst his most remarkable achievements are the documenting of 2 trade networks out of Sindh. That's 2 international trade networks coming out of Sindh. And for this, he's, of course, a great hero of the Sindhi community. So it's a real honor and a privilege for us to have him as a guest on the Tapestry Podcast. Professor Markovits, welcome to our show. And I'd like to start by asking you to tell us something about yourself and your work.
Well, I'm a French historian, and I started writing about Indian history, and the first book on Indian business and nationalist politics, which was published in, because I did a PhD at Cambridge. Then it was published in 1985. And so I got interested in it. Then I had somehow heard, about Sindhis. But I knew nothing about them. I heard some kind of folklore about the Sindhis being everywhere. Jokes like when Armstrong rises on the moon, there's already a Sindhi there. There are similar jokes about Punjabis and probably about Gujaratis.
Malayalis.
It's the sort of folklore, one hears in India. And so, but I was intrigued because I had also seen an old directory in which I had noticed that there were these people with Sindhi names more or less around the world. So I was intrigued, and I decided to try to do research on them. And I realized it was a pretty tricky proposition.
Because?
You must realize we were in the 1990s. I mean, I did my research between 1991 and 1996.
Right.
There was no internet. I mean, it had started, but it wasn't really in wide use. So you didn't have all these resources, online resources that you have now. You really had to dig very deep into archives which were not properly indexed.
Right.
You had to find proxies. The things you were looking for did not exist in the archive.
Right.
For instance, for my research on the Shikapuris in Central Asia, I had to use a proxy which was the death of Indians in Russian territory.
I remember reading that.
Because generally they would be Shikapuris, not 100%, but 90%, let's say. So, I mean, I had to use that kind of proxies. And for Sindhworkies, also, I just don't remember exactly how I got the idea to go to Kew, to the National Archives, which was not a place where Indian historians usually went. The India archives were separate from the global archives. So I don't know exactly from where. I got the idea that maybe I would find some stuff there. And I did find these very useful consular court records from Egypt, Morocco, China, etc., which gave me quite a lot of information on the Sindhworkies. But it was also largely a matter of luck, I mean, whether you found things or not, because the indexes were not properly done at that time.
Right.
So, it was a bit random. We took out files and either it worked or it didn't work. It was great fun, but you wasted a lot of time also. Fortunately, since I had a full-time research job, I could afford to.
Right.
So that's how I got into that. And progressively I found more and more material. And because, I mean, the Shikapuri network I had never heard of before starting the research.
Why do you think you hadn't heard of it?
Because really it was very little known outside the Shikapuris themselves, I mean, very few people knew about Shikapur. I mean, I discovered it in very old books and then these records about Central Asia. But prior to that, I had not even heard about them. Well, I knew about Sindhis in general, but who happened to be the Sindhworkies, but I wasn't very clear about who the Sindhworkies were at the beginning. Yeah, I mean, basically it was detective work.
Yeah.
For me, it was important then to meet some real Sindhis. I interviewed a few merchants in Gibraltar, in London, and in Mumbai. And these encounters were important for me, not for what I learned from them, because I didn't learn much from them, but from the fact that actually I could see that these people were real, that they were not a fiction of the archive.
Right. So, but tell me about your meetings with them. What were they like, and what impression did you come away with from the actual meeting?
It was interesting. I mean, the first meeting I had was with Mr. Kiani in Gibraltar, of the firm Pohumul.
Pohumul, yeah.
Brothers,
Yeah.
One of the oldest firms.
Yeah.
And he was a very courteous gentleman. I had actually met him through some contact I had in Gibraltar through my brother. It was interesting because, I had read a lot about this firm, and it was really interesting to meet somebody from the firm, though. I mean, and he had some interesting stories to tell me, not so much on what I was working on, but more generally. About what it was to have been a Hyderabadi and to go back to Hyderabad after partition, and and rediscover the place where your family had lived.
So he was born
And
after
being
partition.
welcomed by- he was born from the after partition.
Okay.
But he had revisited Hyderabad in the early 70s, and he said that they were welcomed by the locals where their family had lived. So, I mean, no, it was, and there's another gentleman I met in Mumbai who told me some interesting things about his time in Burma. It was interesting because in his house, in the small room where he had his altar, where he did his pujas, he had a big photograph of the Shwedagon pagoda in Rangoon,
Right.
which is really the main landmark in Rangoon.
That meant something to his
Quite
family.
significant of the kind of nostalgia and the memory.
Wow.
These were interesting, but they were not my main source.
Of
main
course.
source was the archives.
So coming to Pohuma, I read somewhere that he had an association with Thomas Cook. Is that?
Yes, that's what he told me. That's what he told me. He told me when they arrived in Egypt in the 1860s, actually, and it was the beginning of tourism there. And so they had an association with Thomas Cook. And he said, well, I don't know if I can really believe that, but he said that at one time they were thinking even of buying up Thomas Cook, because at the beginning they were probably bigger than Thomas Cook. So he said that there was at one point question of a merger.
Wow.
What I found in the archives were often documents, for instance, in these consular court records, you had, for instance, you had cases which were presented to the consular court, disputes between merchants and employees, etc. So it gave you some insight into the workings of the network.
And did you ever visit Sindh?
No, precisely. I never visited. But I must say that when I was doing the research, Sindh was not in a very, very quiet.
Right.
situation. There was a lot of trouble there. So, I mean, the question of going there really didn't arise.
Have you actually met people from the different communities, like in Panama and you said you've been to Gibraltar. Have you met people from the community in Hong Kong, Panama, and the other places that you've written about?
No. Actually, the only people I met were the only meetings I had were in Gibraltar, in Mumbai, and in London. These were the three places. Later, I met somebody in Singapore, but that was later after.
So, any insight into the London from the London interviews?
Yeah, I mean, London was a complicated story because I had contacted a very well-known firm there. I'm not going to give names. And actually, I had found an interesting document about their activities in West Africa. And, as a sort of gesture of goodwill, I gave them a photocopy of that document.
Wow.
They were very eager to take, because they were planning at least to write a history of their firm. So they took it and they sort of, dangled in front of me the prospect of giving me access to some of the archives, but it never happened.
Oh.
So, I mean,
maybe they don't have anything.
So, I mean, it was a transaction in which I was somehow screwed.
Oh.
Oh. But then, I thought about it. I thought, after all, there is a certain logic in the fact that a researcher would be had in a transaction with a trader. So I didn't nourish a grudge.
So when I think about your work,
partly, rather largely inside the archives with the papers. And you, as a person with, such strong intuition, I have wondered, did you kind of have a vision in your mind about what the lives were like, what their shops looked like?
Somehow, but not extremely precise. Because of the lack of documents coming from them directly.
Yeah,
it was difficult to imagine exactly how themselves lived through all this. That's the missing part.
Yeah, that is the missing part.
Because I had no access to whatever they might have written about their own experience. And of course, there's also the fact that they left Hyderabad during partition. And so obviously, they took with them only the important things. And a lot of material probably has remained in Hyderabad and most probably been lost.
Destroyed, so, yeah. Did you ever read that diary of the Sindhwarki written by T.K. Mirchandani? It's just called the Sindhwark and Sindhwarkis.
No, I didn't read it. No.
Would you like to read it? Because I can send you a link. I put it up online.
Yeah, of course I would like to read it. But
I wanted to tell you this. I met somebody in Punta Arenas who told me that his father arrived there in 1907.
Yeah, I knew that the network had gone all the way to Punta Arenas.
Yeah, it's on your map. I met this Nandwani family there, and he told me that his father had come there in 1907 and that he was buying from Japan and selling in South America, which meant that he would travel himself and come back 3 months going and 3 months coming. So he was actually on the sea for 6 months every year. And he was one of the few lucky ones who could visit his home at least once a year because of that. But I was wondering whether you could kind of give us an idea of what that ship journey might have been like.
The life of these people.
Joe, what was the ship journey like? What was it like on the ship? What kind of ships were they?
Well, they used, from what I can gather, they used the regular steamers, But then I suppose that those, who were the principals, they would travel first class, and then the shop assistants would probably travel second class, and then the servants, those who were, characterized as servants, would travel third class. So,
right.
Because it was a very socially structured world, It was not a community of equals.
Yes. And did you get a chance to find out anything about the women and how they lived?
I did find a little bit about the women, the fact that they were left behind. They rarely accompanied the husbands. There were a few cases of women who accompanied the husbands. But then, of course, there was the interesting story of the Brahma Kumaris, that sect which was born in the milieu of Hyderabadi merchants and which had a strong female component. But I didn't go deep into that.
But what can you tell us about it?
The fact is that it was tough for the women.
Yeah.
Because the men were away. Well, once again, there were differences between the principals and the others. But let's say for those who were not the principals, they would generally be away for two or 3 years and then come back for, let's say for 6 months in Hyderabad and then go again. And so, put a big strain on marital life, obviously. On top of that, there was always the suspicion that the men, when they were abroad, had local concubines or local wives, etc. And we know that it did happen. We don't know how common it was, but it did certainly happen. The situation for the women was not an easy one. Actually, it would certainly be possible to write a kind of feminist history of this.
I think we talked more about the Hyderabad network. So let's go to Shikarpur and, please tell us something about that camel route.
The Shikarpur network was very difficult to penetrate, and in a way, I mean, I knew less about it than about the Sindhuakis. And the only Shikapuris I actually met were the Hinduja family. That they are a very special kettle of fish. Actually, I met them after I finished the book, and then they made some. They contacted me at least twice through intermediaries, hinting that they would be interested in having something written, etc. But nothing to that. And the trajectory of the Hinduja family is very specific. They were in Iran and it's really an Iranian. The people I mostly worked on were in Central Asia, also in Xinjiang. And so it was a different setup. And the evidence I had was mostly from the succession documents. Offered an interesting insight, but once again, you sort of gazed at them from outside, but you had no inkling of what their own thoughts and their own experience was.
Yeah, nobody wrote or told anyone about their lives as such, what they were. Yeah.
It remained a bit of a mystery for me. Still, I mean, I had documents which were quite interesting, so I could at least produce a sort of general outline. My fundamental interest was in understanding how these kind of trading networks function, how it was possible from a fairly small town in India to develop and control the network, which was very extensive geographically, which took in very different political contexts and economic contexts and all that. But that was really the basic thrust, of my inquiry. How did it work? How was it possible? And so I was led to put forward a certain number of hypotheses on these networks, how they work. And that was something which puts me slightly on a different trajectory from the people who are really from Sindh and who are interested in the Sindhis as such. I was interested in them as instances of networks which had developed a certain kind of way of working. Originally, my interest was not in Sindh and Sindhis as such. As I discovered them, I got more interested after I realized how little literature there was on Sindh. So this led me to take more of an interest in that dimension. But it was not my original, reading.
No, of course. That, in fact, you said that in your books as well. That was just incidental. One of the things that I wanted to ask you is that after partition, when all these businessmen were displaced from Sindh, and of course, many of them already had bases in other parts of the world. But there were some who came to the truncated India. And if they, their business expertise had been made use of by the government of India, do you think the Indian economy would have grown differently?
India in the immediate post-partition and etc. was going through a different, trying to build some kind of socialism. So, these people are not really fit for that.
So the example that I had in my mind is of Bhai Pratap. You've written about the Diyal Das family.
Yeah, Diyal Das. Yeah.
Bhai Pratap, he, set up a town in Gujarat called Gandhi.
Yeah, I know about this story.
He built a port there, and he also created it as a free trade zone.
Yeah. No, I know about that story, but some people have looked at it.
It's kind of a hypothetical question about whether the government of India didn't realize that, they had these resources which could have improved the Indian condition kind of thing?
One can always speculate. I mean, it was a very complicated story because there were problems between the government and Jaldas, and he was actually in jail for some time in Petrol. It's a very complicated story. I didn't enter that story. Once again, I did this research in the 1990s. So I wrote the book in the late 1990s. It was published in 2000. That means 22 years ago.
Yeah.
At first, it didn't attract any attention. Nobody took any notice of it. And then somehow, it started attracting a certain level of attention, and it became a sort of classic, work about trading networks, and even some people who worked on other networks thought it was useful for them to help them understand the way these networks function. So, I mean, it was a late recognition, but I mean, it was quite interesting. I mean, for me, I mean, and somehow the book still sells a little bit.
Oh yeah, of course. As I said, for the Sindhi diaspora, it's really a landmark work.
Well, I didn't know much about the reaction in the Sindhi community because actually I sent one copy to Mr. Kiani,
right,
in Gibraltar, and he thanked me. And but then I didn't hear about what his reaction had been or anything. So, I mean, I don't know. I didn't really know. I know that some people used it sometimes, some firms used it in their advertisements, and they were mentioned in that book, that sort of thing. But I didn't know much about the way it was received. And I received some letters from people of the Sindhi community saying they'd been very interested and they had read it. And so, I mean, obviously, I mean, it had struck a chord.
Yeah.
But I didn't know much about it.
But let's hope we can put it up on a podcast and then we'll see what kind of reaction we get. That should be interesting. As far as I know, people really are fascinated by your work. I wanted to ask you also, you've written about Gandhi.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering whether you can draw a thread between Gandhi and the Sindhis.
One common trait was expatriation. I mean, Gandhi was in South Africa for almost 20 years. And by the way, he did have contact with Sindhi traders there. He was involved in at least one or two cases.
Representing them?
Yes, representing them, because one way the colonial bureaucracy and basically one way of controlling the movements of merchants, which were totally independent of the government. One way of controlling their movements was by using quarantine regulations.
Okay.
Because there was always some plague or cholera in India.
Right.
So, you would then impose a quarantine on ships coming from India. And this would be terrible for traders. If you are quarantined with your goods and all that, you just lose money. And that was one way. And there was a lot in South Africa. There was a lot of pressure from various traders who didn't like the Indian traders, and they tried to put the fetters in their work. So there was one case in which Gandhi intervened in a case to try to alleviate the problem for some of these Sindhi traders. So he mentions the Sindhi traders. So.
I've read this quote from him where he says, "One finds Sindhis in South America. There's hardly any place in the world where Sindhis are not found. In South Africa, they were making big money and they gave of it liberally to the poor. They have one vice. namely drinking. They do not seem to be able to give it up.
Yeah, that was one aspect I didn't really go into, but Hyderabadis had a reputation of being quite fond of liquor. And apparently it was very easy to get it in Hyderabad. It was one of the places in India where you could really get it. Whether the drinking habit is something they had acquired during those long voyages, or whether there was something different, I don't know. But certainly it was one thing which was told about them.
And but the Shikarpuris were different?
I don't know about the Shikarpuris. From what I could gather, looked a very, very austere set of people, very almost ascetic. That's the impression they gave various observers, and also it comes out of the documents. They lived with very little in these little, these sarais in the fastness of Central Asia, and they seem to have led a very a rather sad and restricted life there. But once again, this is the impression we get from the outside. We don't really know how they themselves
actually lived, yeah. You mentioned some correspondence you came across between the Russian court and the heirs of the Shikarpuri merchants who died intestate.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just tell us something about that?
It was a very complicated legal problem. Shikarpuris, being Hindus, although they were also in some way Narakantis, but that's a different question. I'm not going to enter into that. But so generally they die intestate. Then the question is who the heirs are. This is, let's say, somewhere near Bukhara, and the family lives in Shikarpur. There's no way you can travel easily from Shikarpur to Bukhara. It's not something you can do like that. And so what's going to happen? How is the succession going to be settled? It's a really fascinating story because there are actually two different systems. There is an official system for the transmission of these successions, which is extremely cumbersome. The authorities of the Sultanate of Bukhara, the Emirate of Bukhara, the Russian authorities, the British Foreign Office, the India Office. It's an extraordinarily cumbersome process, which can take years, for a sum of money to be transferred from a small locality in the Emirate of Bukhara to Shikarpur. So sometimes it is used. But often it is not used, and there is a different system, a parallel system, which is set up by the Shikarpuri Panchayat of the place where the merchant who died, which is that there is a deal entered into with the family. The succession is put to auction. It's put to auction for a sum which is generally quite inferior to the actual worth,
of course,
of the succession. But then the family, through Hindis, recuperates that sum very quickly. For hard-pressed people, and generally the wives, widows, sons, daughters of these merchants, they are quite hard-pressed. For them, recuperating the money quickly, even if it's less than what they should actually get, is interesting. So very often they go through that parallel system.
Welcome back, and Saz, I missed the interview. I obviously heard it separately, but it was great to, I was excited to have him on the show, that he agreed, and you covered a lot of topics with him. I know you yourself had a few stories about the whole Sindh working network that you had written about previously. Maybe we can discuss some of that as well, and look into how these people sort of made their way around from country to country.
So I think what we can do now is talk about some of the things that Markovits, that I discussed with Markovits.
Yep.
For example, he mentioned about the women. he mentioned that, I asked him, do you know anything about the lives of the women? And he said, no, not really, because there's nothing written down.
Correct.
So the thing that I can tell you from talking to some of the women who I have interviewed, so I interviewed this lady who told me about her life as a Sindhwarki wife. She grew up in Karachi after partition, but her family had stores in Gibraltar, and later she got married and went to Gibraltar. So she wasn't really living that life which the women led, where they were all alone, and the men would come back every few years. Right. And then, they would just see them for a short period of time, and they would go back. They had to do everything themselves. They had to look after the homes, they had to look after the families, they had to take the, domineering mother-in-law without having the husband to make that
be around. Yep.
Which is what a lot of women in India even today have. Talking about domineering mother-in-laws, she told me about this neighbor she had who would not allow her daughter-in-law to hug her children. And she just wouldn't let her daughter-in-law. She was such a nosy person. She expected her son to sleep with the bedroom door open. And she didn't allow them to close their bedroom door. And this thing about the children, she just would say that you can't do that. You're spoiling them. Don't hug them. Yeah. And the women hardly ever went out, right? So they would go out. Her mother-in-law would go out when there was a funeral or something. So that would be such a moment of joy for this lady, because then she could hug her children. She could hug her children. I mean, she could just hug her children. And I think this is kind of a very extreme case, but it tells you a little, it's an actual thing that happened, it tells you, just gives you a tiny little glimpse into what can happen in a family where there's full power, where, somebody has power and just wants to dominate the other, which I think a lot of, I don't think that's really Sindhwarki monopoly. I think it's there everywhere.
Generally, probably,
not anymore. Yeah. Then the other thing we discussed, I asked him whether he'd read that book called Sindhwark and the Sindhwarkis, which is written by Amir Chandani. Sindhwarki salesmen earned quite a lot from the foreigners, and more people entered the trade. Some got the bright idea of going out of Sindh to sell their wares. The first stop was Bombay, which was a British stronghold. The first immigrants to Bombay called themselves Sethas and employed younger men to roam the city and sell their products. The Sethas found out that a large population of English had congregated in Egypt and the Strait settlements. So Setha Bhai Pohumal set sail for Egypt and Bhai Basyamal for the Strait settlements. So like one is going west and one is going east.
Correct.
When they touched the ground and found a firm footing, they sent for their salesmen in Bombay and set up offices in these lands. Others learned of the pots of gold at the end of the rainbow, and trade prospered, soon spreading all over the world. Many Sethas entered the fray. Now, the thing is, he goes on to talk about the kind of lives they were made to lead, because they were in a town far away from home. Correct. And they were at the mercy, the boys who worked in the shops, they were at the mercy of the Sethas.
Right.
So they were exploited so badly. You heard of the young men, they did all the work, they did the housework, they had to massage the Sethas' feet in the evening and wash his clothes, and and then very often, so they were not paid anything over there. They were it was just their board, and their families were paid. And they were promised lump sum at the end of the Musafri. Right. And quite often they were cheated. They would go home and wait for the money, and the money wouldn't come. So they would be waiting. When they went home also, they were happy to be home. But those two things would happen. One is they would just keep saying, where's my money? Where's my money? Sometimes they got it, sometimes they didn't. And the second thing is, am I being taken back? Am I getting a fresh contract or not? And they never knew. So that was something.
Were they like selling their wares in, so to say, to other firms or other people if, once they came back and they didn't feel like they were...
they did have an option of getting a contract with another firm.
Yep.
But then again, the community is so tight, and I don't think it's, you can't say that this is a terrible thing about the Sindhis. It's just the way capitalists work, right? You have your resources and you have to optimize them.
Correct.
So, if part of that is being like cruel, bad luck.
It's too bad, yeah.
Yeah.
If it was so bad, what was the incentive for many of them to go back? Was it like, in a few years, I'll go set up my own sort of thing? I'm just learning this for now.
Everyone who went and worked in another firm was looking for a way to, branch out on their own. Everybody didn't do it, but everybody mostly they wanted to do it because this was the community, And one thing I've seen is the difference between it was my business and I was working for someone else. So there's a status. If it's your own business, even if it's a small shop, but you're working for someone else and you're the managing director of their company, this guy still gets the guy who's doing his own business is still considered a little more. Of course, money puts you apart, no doubt. Money always gets respect. And for me, like as a working person, I would ask quite, not meaning anything, not seeing the meaning into it. I would say like, okay, so your father was working in Durban. No, my father had his own business in Durban.
Right.
So that is, that's
how
it works.
It's definitely a thing in Sindhis where there is that difference if you're working versus,
Yeah. So there's this other book also called Beyond the Rainbow by Murli Melwani, which is a much more recent book. It's after partition, but that also takes you very deep into this Sindhi diaspora, and it shows you how the Sindhwarkis live. Because even though everything changed after partition, the main thing that changed was that they were trade outposts before. But after partition, the families had to join the men. So they mostly went and lived with them, and those trade outposts just flourished into communities, and that's there in all the ports. Many of the families, they couldn't afford it, so they would set up a base. And my city, Pune, has so many Sindhwarki families who still live. I mean, there aren't that many, of course, not like that huge population, but it is still a thing where the women and children, they want education, if they want education in English, or if you're in Africa, for example, the education. Now, of course, Africa is also different. There are international schools in the places where the Sindhis have their business. But if there isn't, or if you can't afford it, then you have your family in Pune where the education is excellent and, it is not that expensive also. So that lifestyle hasn't changed completely. I mean, it's not as barbaric, it's not as savage as it used to be. And of course, we also as a people have kind of moved on, and, we're not, we are slightly more liberal than we used to be.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think times have changed, but you're right. I mean, from my own family, my mom's two brothers, my mom's three brothers actually, all lived in Nigeria, Lagos, which is one of the Sindhi trade posts.
Yes.
And basically, when their kids came of age, they continued on the business there, but they sent the mums, so my mommies and their kids, back to Pune, actually. So they live in Pune, and they spent their higher education and college years in Pune. Of course, they did this back in the early 90s when, you could only go up to a certain level in school in Lagos, and then you did have to look for other alternatives outside. So in the 90s, they sent them back to Pune. So they did spend, 20 odd years apart like that, but the early years were sort of in that outpost there in Nigeria, which had actually been established by my nana, who had spent his life basically traveling around Colombo and Cairo and parts of Africa. And he had even been out to the Far East, where, my wife's from the Philippines, and when I took her family to introduce them to my nana, of course, it was his last few years, but he could already, there was a connection there. The moment I told him they're from Manila, he was like, I spent time there, and suddenly the stories were there from Manila and stuff. So this was one of the true Sindh workies who had spent his time, either with other firms or doing his own thing, selling around the world, and then going and establishing his own franchise or business in Nigeria, where then his sons took over. So sort of it fits the mold in many ways, and it fits the story we've heard and seen, and Claude Markovits has written about. But yeah, that's my mom's side of the family.
One of the things I find most fascinating about this community is that it is so widespread. It is across so many countries, immersed in those cultures, because a lot of times children are going to school in local schools and they're learning the local language, and that's their first language.
Yep.
But even then, the community is so connected, because for two reasons. One is for trade, and the other is for marriage.
Yes.
So, if you're a Bhaiband girl and you live in Curacao, you know very well that you can get married and you can land up in Dubai or in Lagos or in Jakarta or,
the States, anywhere, yeah.
So I the metaphor that I like to use is that the community might be rootless, but they have global ties. They have ties that bind them around the globe. And,
absolutely. And it's still prevalent today, where many Sindhi businessmen and women who are still continuing either family businesses or have done their own thing rely on these networks to do a lot of their trade. And my dad's side of the business, they had their garments export, who were their primary importers. It was all the Sindhis in Spain, in North America, in Curacao, in Latin America. They were selling their stuff to basically these people who were essentially Sindhi Bhaiwans who had gone on and, either stayed on there or done their own thing. But now they were importing from other Sindhis in India, from India, basically. So it's a flourishing thing that has just, as you said, has its roots way back when, but it probably still continues today.
Still continues. And, in Murli's book, Beyond the Rainbow, one of many of them are really like the stories tell you how Sindhis do business. So that it's like, I always call it a business manual, but it also has some funny stories, like the ones about the matchmaking. And they have this season in India, which is, I think, December, January, where the families come looking for a match for the eligible boy or girl in their family, and they have these matrinaries the matchmakers who knows everybody, who knows all the families which have eligible, and they know how to match them based on how many zeros they have in their annual income and things like that. And
Netflix should do a series. Netflix should just do a series of Indian matchmaking on the Sindhis. I think they'll have ample material just from that.
Yeah. So this is one thing. The other thing that I'm so glad we got those lovely stories from Professor Markovits about Gandhi. I really thought that was fantastic because Gandhi was so big in Sindh,
Yes.
People in Sindh loved him. And apparently, Gandhi also loved the Sindhis. So that's something that I actually wrote about in my new book, Losing Home, Finding Home. So that it's an illustrated book. And when I met I was very lucky to find an artist to do the illustrations. And the only brief I had is that I want them to be historically authentic.
Yep.
And I want the people to be recognizable. So whoever it is, whether it's somebody from a family album, whether it's the Nehru Gandhi, everyone should know who it is. It should be. And he was so good. His name is Shubhadeep Mukherjee. He lives in Bombay. Of course, he studied at Shanti Niketan and did his master's from Baroda and all that. But when you look at the pictures, which, if you're looking at this on YouTube, then I'll show you one or two. When we met, we'd already started working and we'd done half the work on the book. But when we met, he said to me, what, Saz, a book like this should have a really fabulous center spread. Right. And I just got a bit worried about, oh my God, what am I going to do? Is it going to be a map or what? And then I suddenly remembered this picture that I'd seen, which I think appeared in a magazine called Ratan Jot, which was a Sindhi magazine. And It's a picture of Gandhi's visit, his first visit to Sindh in 1919. So 1919, he was still fresh out of Africa. He wasn't dressing the way that he dressed. We see him. He was wearing that turban from his native community, and he was much younger. And he's sitting in the middle of a crowd of Sindhi people. Obviously, next to him are the elite of the city, and around it's like a lot of people. There are a few women and children in front who are obviously the families of the people who are sitting next to him.
Right.
So I decided that take that picture, and it's one of the only images in the book which is not 100% historically authentic, because we took Gandhi and all the people around him. Some of them who were recognizable, we left them as they were, but some of them who was pretty kind of faceless, I told Shubho, can you put this guy in? Like, for example, L.K. Advani is in that picture, although he actually wasn't there back then.
He wasn't there, yeah.
He wouldn't have been in one of those Gandhi meetings. And of course, I obviously put my grandfather and his brothers in there, at least one of them. But a lot of people who I've interviewed, whose photos I've had, well-known people, freedom fighters, they all got in, lots and lots of them. But the crux of this is that Gandhi is in the center of the story. And because it's a center spread, Gandhi is partitioned. You've got Gandhi on both sides. And for me, that was like the,
symbolic,
ultimate metaphor in the book, because everybody loved Gandhi. But after partition, of course, they weren't sure about.
They were divided feelings. Yep.
Yeah. And you heard that quote which I read out to Professor Markovits about Gandhi saying that Sindhis love to drink.
Yes.
And of course, you know that, right? Because we've spoken about Johnny Walker in previous episodes.
You will always hear a reference about Johnny Walker from me.
Yeah, but I think now the Sindhis would be drinking the finest malt. The Johnny Walker days are like probably.
Oh yeah, of course. Johnny Walker is just the symbolic way of saying it. It's just
it's a symbol. Really, it's a symbol. And as Claude Markovits said, that the Sindh Varkis obviously had free access to it, and there was no restriction in Hyderabad. So that was.
Correct. And I would think any of the other whiskey names today probably don't sound as much fun as Johnny Walker when you say it in with the Sindhi accent. So I love to mock my own ancestry in that regard.
Yeah. So I did ask him this question. I did ask Claude Markovits the question about, would the Indian economy have grown differently after independence if the Sindhi businessmen had been in charge? And of course, that's an extremely naive kind of question to ask somebody who's so steep in, business history and economics. But I wanted to say, and I speak about Bhai Pratap quite often, he was responsible for building Kandla Port, and he was responsible for making it a special economic zone, which was the first special economic zone in area, I think, in Asia. And, that kind of understanding free trade could really have done something for India if it had been used. Sadly enough, that never happened.
It never, materialized. Oh, well.
So that's it for this episode then?
Yes, that's it. And glad we could have Claude Markovits on. We were so excited that he accepted, and we managed to get a full interview with him despite all the technological issues. But, enjoy the episode. What I'll say is follow us on Tapestry Pod on Twitter. You have our YouTube channel where you'll see us and a variety of pictures, hopefully. And in due course, we'll be out with our next one. See you then.
सॼी दुनिया में पंहिंजो नालो कयोसीं अरे देश धर्म लाइ ॻोठ छॾियोसीं सॼी दुनिया में पंहिंजो नालो कयोसीं देश धर्म लाइ ॻोठ छॾियोसीं सॼी दुनिया में पंहिंजो नालो कयोसीं हो माण्हू लंडन वारा माण्हू पेरिस वारा माण्हू दुबई वारा अमेरिका वारा ओ जियो सिंधी Oh जियो सिंधी अरे जियो सिंधी ओ जियो सिंधी